There's no two better people on planet Earth to give you a briefing about what just happened in the Middle East, why it hasn't been successful, what does it mean, and the global ramifications in places like Ukraine and Russia at the intersection of law, politics, and foreign policy and national security than Asha and Renato on their show, It's Complicated. This week, they're joined by General Mark Hertling to talk about the aftermath of the Middle East and what it means going forward and how Donald Trump needs to be reined in, hopefully by Congress and other guardrails on It's Complicated. It isn't when they describe it to you in brief you. And here's a clip.
So, Mark, while we have you here, we would be remiss if we also did not talk about the domestic situation and how the military is getting sucked into that. And I am curious what your take is on, that whole shit show, basically, that we're seeing happening.
It's a good way to describe it. There is, in many people's view, and I'm one of them, an attempt to politicize the military, whereas at the same time, an attempt to insult the institution of the military, which is fascinating to me. I happen to have the chance to have been at both the West Point graduation this year to hear President Trump speak, and then later on watch him on TV as he spoke to soldiers at Fort Bragg. And in both cases, there was a visible attempt of politicizing the audiences and getting them on his side. And I find that extremely troubling from a civil military affairs standpoint. The military exists to serve the country. They do not exist to serve one man. And there's a constant drumbeat about loyalty toward Trump. One of the things I did when I was commanding in Europe is when I did engagements with other nations, I would always ask their soldiers, where do you swear allegiance to? And there would be when we take our oath, we swear allegiance to the king or the queen or the motherland or the fatherland or the president or whatever. We don't do that. We swear our allegiance to a piece of paper, that constitution that represents ideas and culture and ideology. And it's backed up by, papers and conversations and speeches that have taken place over the last 250 years. So when you see an individual who is trying to gain loyalty and fire people willy-nilly, I'll use that phrase that my mother used to use all the time, of firing people because they don't seem to have any real competence problems, but they happen to be of a certain race or a certain gender, that's problematic to me because our military is extremely diverse in its nature. Then, when you also see the militarization of ICE agents, border patrols, and police on the street, all wearing camouflage dress and body armor and carrying M4s or M16s and long rifles and have NOD helmets on and all that other stuff, you say to yourself, holy smokes, there's an attempt to, in our country, where only about 1% of our citizens serve in the military, there's an attempt to confuse on who's on which side. And then when you introduce the National Guard, which is legal, as you know, he can federalize the Guard if he wants. He usually has to get permission from the governor because that is the governor's military. But he did it, and the court ruled in favor of him. But you also are putting Marines on the streets of our city. I think that's an attempt to further confuse the citizenry of who's in charge and who's loyal to who. And truthfully, what I've watched is the American support for institutions, the courts, the law, the Congress, and the military. And what I'm seeing is the public support for the military is declining from a very high level that occurred in the early 2000s to now. And it's especially gone off the cliff in terms of some of these things and I get feedback from people saying, how come you guys don't step in and stop this? Well, because the generals won't stop this. You elected the guy. It's up to you to stop it. We're here to defend the country. But people are now seeing us as a hedge against some of his actions. So that's kind of a long dialogue, or diatribe, I guess. But those are some of the things that are happening to the military that really concern me, as they should be apolitical, and people should realize we serve the nation and not one individual.
One thing that you mentioned, that a lot of citizens were wondering, hey, why isn't the military stepping in? There's one person in particular who had a very important role in ensuring that the military wasn't politicized, and that was General Milley. And by his own telling, it sounds like he, at times, stepped up to ensure that there wasn't a misuse of the military. And that has made him an enemy of the current president, who has tried to turn him into a sort of an enemy within, just like he did with James Comey, the director of the FBI, and many others.
Anthony Fauci.
Yes, exactly.
All the leaders of key institutions in America. The press, he's going after the press now. So, yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting, but yeah, that's part of the game plan.
Well, and I was wondering what your reaction was to that, because General Milley, of course, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and had a very distinguished military career. And it was apparent to me that he had great respect for the apolitical nature of our military.
Yeah. And what I'd also add to that some people may have forgotten, is that Trump picked Milley over the advice of the Secretary of Defense, who wanted someone else. So he was Trump's pick. And then because he lived up to his oath and understood civil military relations and tried to establish that firewall between politicalization of the military, he's now one of the bad guys. So my feeling on that is, I know General Milley not well. He and I ran in different circles. He was an infantry guy. I was a tanker. So we didn't clash too often, but I did know of him. And the fact is, I mean, he's got it right from his ideology and his oath to the Constitution. So this is a perfect example of how the good guys, when they don't bend the knee or take the bow, suddenly become the bad guys. And even to the point of being threatened and their families being threatened.
So, Mark, what does that mean now with the change in the leadership? Right. So we obviously have Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. As you mentioned, we have Marines deployed in LA. I suspect that we're going to see military in other cities as well. And Trump has, or Hegseth, I guess, has, he dismissed the original, the JAGs that were in place, and I don't know if he's replaced them. How does this all translate on the ground? Like, we know, I mean, I assume, soldiers and Marines are all taught about posse comitatus. I don't, and my guess is they are also not trained to do law enforcement. I mean, law enforcement and being in a war are very different things. They should be different things. Do you feel confident? We talk about you don't have to follow an illegal order and people, but where does that happen? Like, who does that? Whose call is it? And where, who would know to say no? We're not talking about like to burn this village, burn down LA and, kill everybody. I mean, short of that.
Yeah, it is, to answer your question very simply, it's the commander's call. The commander of any formation is responsible for what his or her troops do. And they're the ones that know that it's wrong to execute an illegal order, that they have to stand up for that they have to stop that. Context of the two speeches I saw. At the West Point speech, where you had 1,000 brand new lieutenants sitting in front of President Trump, and he was starting the politicalization in his speech, insulting the previous presidents, insulting the generals, saying, I mean, it was really pretty disgusting. The 1,000 cadets up there had a poker face. They were sitting in the audience. There was no applause. There was nothing going on because they had been told by their chain of command, hey, beforehand, hey, you may have your views, but if you're wearing the uniform, you don't show any political lean. Whereas the troops at Fort Bragg, which really was embarrassing to me, and I think embarrassing to their commanders, were not only not told that, it appears, but they were allowed to be part of a mob scene, standing behind the president and cheering. Now, in the military, because we draw our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and Coast Guard and Space Force people from the population, you're going to have different views. But they are taught from all of our military personnel are taught from basic training that their personal views don't matter if they're wearing the uniform. What matters is their support for the country. And what they're also taught is the legalities of taking orders, either illegal or immoral orders. So, but it's up to the commanders to enforce that. So you see these guys on the ground doing different things. And there was the famous picture of the Marine putting the flex cuffs on the one guy that was trying to get into a building. That was one incident. And there was a lot made of that incident. And it was some guy, probably some Marine trying to do the best he could to guard a building. But I'm sure he was, chided afterwards by his commander saying, that's not our job. We are not the police. We're here to guard the building. So knock it off. But the things that's troubling when those guys showed up, what I noticed is some things that probably most Americans would not have noticed is they had flex cuffs on their vest. They had weapons, unloaded more than likely, but they had weapons. And you don't, unless you use those for your personal defense when you're in a bad situation, you shouldn't be flashing those around. So there's some nuance in all of this, Asha, and it's really hard to convince people that the military knows what they're doing. And the reason it's hard to convince them of that is because every once in a while, some young 18-year-old does something dumb and it taints the whole organization. Now, what I will say is one more thing. It was fascinating for me to see in the press conference the day after the bombing that Secretary Hegseth and Chairman of Joint Staff General Kane, were at the two platforms. Hegseth said one thing about, I backed the president on everything he said about it, obliterated it. When they went to Kane, he said, well, we still got to do BDA and we're not sure what happened yet. So he was doing what the military does. But one thing that I would point out, in all of the meetings except the night before the bombing, you're seeing a lot of meetings with President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, and all of his cabinet in committee meetings, what used to be called primary committees, but the military representative is not there. That concerns me. Where's Kane when those things are going on? Or where is his vice chairman? Because the SecDef and the chairman both have equal voices in those rooms. And what I'm concerned about is how tough is it for Dan Kane to do what he's been trained to do in that kind of an environment?
Well, I will say, from my perspective as a citizen, there's a lot to be concerned about. I think there's so much at stake for our country, and really the politicization of the military can be a threat to the Constitution. So I appreciate your voice. I appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us, because you're an example of somebody who's really standing up for the Constitution. So thank you, Mark. I really appreciate you joining us. I feel like we've learned a lot from you.
Well, thanks to both of you, because not only is the military and the media, the journalists, important and are specifically named in the Constitution, but so is the importance of the rule of law. So we got something going on between the three of us, right?
Yes,
That's
for sure. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome back. If you like that kind of content, now's your chance. Hit the free subscribe button. Help us to continue to grow this pro-democracy channel in collaboration with the Midas Touch Network. I'm Michael Popak. I do the curating around here on all things Legal AF. Podcast Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on the Midas Touch Network. Legal AF, the YouTube channel. We do hot takes about every hour at the intersection of law and politics, and Legal AF, the Substack. So until my next report, I'm Michael Popak. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.